Hey, welcome back. I think we're going to finish our book today, or at least the story part. I think the author has a note at the end that I'll read to you, just to tell you a little bit about the book. But we're going to start with Mahmoud. Hungary to Germany, 2015. He's 17 days from home. Hungarian people on both sides of the road stopped and stared as Mahmoud and the rest of the refugees marched down the middle of the highway. Men, women, children, they had all come pouring out of the detention center after Mahmoud, joined by the UN observers and the police, had done nothing to stop him. The refugees stretched from one side of the northbound lane to the other, blocking cars from passing them. Packs of young Syrian men walked and laughed together. A Palestinian woman pushed a stroller with a sleeping girl in it. An Afghan family sang a song. The refugees wore jeans and sneakers and hoodies tied around their waists and carried what little they still owned in backpacks and trash bags. Mahmoud's father and mother found him and Walid in the crowd. "Mahmoud, what are you doing?" his father cried. "We're walking to Austria," Walid said. Dad showed them the map on his phone. "But it's a 12-hour walk," he said. "We can do it," Mahmoud said. "We've already come this far. We can go just a little farther." Mahmoud's mother pulled him into a hug, and then Walid, and soon their father had joined them. Refugees streamed around them, and when Mahmoud's mother let them all go, she was smiling and crying at the same time. Cars honked behind the marchers, trying to get past. More cars stopped on the other side of the highway to honk and cheer them on or boo them. A police van pulled up on the opposite side of the road, and through a loudspeaker, a policeman told everyone in Arabic, "Stop, or you will be arrested." But no one stopped, and no one was arrested. Mahmoud and his family walked with the crowd for hours, visible, exposed. It was scary but energizing too. They marched quietly, calmly, flashing peace signs at people who cheered them on from the sidelines. Police cars were spinning red lights, paced them on the other side of the road, occasionally weeping to warn some car away. News helicopters flew overhead, and a woman from the New York Times worked her way through the crowd, asking Mahmoud questions and interviewing refugees. "See us?" Mahmoud thought. "Hear us. Help us." 12 hours had seemed like nothing when Mahmoud added up all the time they had been walking since they had left Aleppo. But this walk quickly seemed endless. They had no water and no food, and Mahmoud's stomach growled and his lips were dry. He felt like one of the zombies from his favorite video game. All he wanted to do was lie down and sleep, but Mahmoud knew they couldn't stop. If they stopped, the Hungarians would arrest them. They had to keep moving forward. Always forward, even if it killed them. Later that night, Mahmoud and his family at last reached the border of Austria. There was no fence, no wall, no border checkpost, just a blue traffic sign by the side of the road with the words Republic Austria inside the EU's circle of gold stars, and above it a sign with a red and white flag of Austria. The Hungarian police cars stopped, following them as soon as they stepped across the border, and the refugees paused to hug each other and celebrate their escape. Mahmoud fell to his knees, fighting back tears of exhaustion and happiness. They had made it. It wasn't Germany, not yet, but Germany was just one country away. The refugees were still laughing and congratulating each other when the phone Mahmoud's father carried beeped an alarm. So did another phone and another, until the whole crowd was a chorus of alarms. It was time for the Aisha's prayer, the last prayer of the day. Mahmoud's dad used an app called Islam to find the exact direction they could face to pray to Mecca. Mahmoud's family found a patch of grass all to themselves, and the hundreds of other refugees did the same. And soon they were all bowing and praying together. It wasn't ideal. They were supposed to wash themselves and pray in a clean place, but it was more important to pray at the right time than in the right place. As he recited the first chapter, Mahmoud thought about the words, "Thee alone we worship, and Thee alone we ask for help. Show us the straight path." Their path had been anything but straight, but Allah had delivered them to this place. With His blessings, they might actually reach Germany. When Mahmoud finished his prayers and opened his eyes, he saw a small group of Austrians had gathered at the edge of the praying refugees. There were police officers there too, and more cars with flashing lights. And Mahmoud sagged. They only see us when we do something they don't like, he thought again. The refugees had stopped to get down on their knees and pray, and these people watching them didn't do that. Didn't understand. Now the refugees looked foreign again, alien, like they didn't belong. Mahmoud worried what the crowd might do when the Austrians told them they didn't want them. Their march through Hungary had been peaceful until now. Would this turn into another fight that would see them gassed and handcuffed and thrown into prison again? "Welcome to Austria," one of the Austrians said in a heavily accented Arabic, and others yelled welcome and applauded. Actually applauded them. Mahmoud looked around at Walid, who was stunned as Mahmoud. Was there some mistake? Did these people think they were something other than Syrian refugees? Suddenly they were surrounded by Austrians, men, women, and children, all smiling and trying to shake the hands and give them things. A woman gave Mahmoud's mother a handful of clean clothes, and a man worried over his father's cuts and bruises. A boy about Mahmoud's age, wearing a New York Yankees jersey, handed him a plastic shopping bag with bread and cheese and fruit and a bottle of water in it. Mahmoud was so thankful he almost wept. Thank you, Mahmoud said in Arabic. Bitte, the boy said, which Mahmoud guessed was German for "you're welcome." The Austrians, they learned, had seen their march on the television and had come out to help them. It was like that all the way up the road to Nickelsdorf, the closest Austrian town with a train station. White native-born Austrians and olive-skinned Arab Austrians who had recently immigrated to the country filled the overpasses, throwing bottles of water and food down to them, bread, fresh fruit, bags of chips. A man next to Mahmoud caught a whole grilled chicken wrapped in aluminum foil. "We are with you. Go with God," the woman shouted down to them in Arabic. Mahmoud's heart lifted. They weren't invisible anymore, hidden away in the detention center. People were finally seeing them, and good people were helping them. At last, Mahmoud and his family reached the Nickelsdorf train station, where they bought tickets to Vienna, the capital of Austria. They traveled overnight by train, and then they arrived in Vienna the next morning. They bought tickets to Munich, a large city in Germany. In Munich, the response was the same as in Austria, only bigger. There were thousands of refugees at the train station, and moving among them were hundreds of regular German people offering bottles of water and cups of coffee and tea. One couple had bought a basket full of candy and were handing pieces out to children. Mahmoud and Walid joined in the happy mob of kids around them, and each got a couple of candies, which they wolfed down. A more organized effort was unloading a truck full of fresh fruit, and another group was handing out diapers to anyone with babies. Seeing the diapers reminded Mahmoud of Hannah, and he looked up at his mother. He could tell she was thinking of his baby sister too. She put a hand to her mouth, and soon she was working her way through the crowd again, asking anyone and everyone if they had seen her daughter, but no one had seen or heard of a baby plucked from the water. If the people who had rescued her made it to safety, though, they were likely somewhere in Germany. Mahmoud and his family would just have to keep looking. An official-looking German man with a name tag that said Serhat, a Turkish name, approached Mahmoud's father with a clipboard in hand. "Are you and your family seeking asylum in Germany?" he asked in perfect Arabic. Mahmoud held his breath. Was this it? Was this the end of their long, horrible nightmare near? Could they finally stop moving, stop sleeping and praying in doorways and bus stations? In Germany, Mahmoud and his family could make new lives for themselves. Mahmoud could finally find a way to reconnect with Walid. They could find Hannah, get his dad laughing and joking again, find peace for his mom. After coming so far, after losing so much, it felt like Mahmoud and his family were almost to the promised land. All they had to do was make room in their hearts for Germany, the way it had made room for them, and accept the strange new place as their home. "Yes," Mahmoud's father said, a smile slowly growing across his face. 1,000 times yes. They've made it and they're safe. So, Isabel, Miami, Florida, 1994, home. This was the coda to Isabel's song. She stood with a trumpet in hand, a gift from Uncle Guillermo, Elito's brother. She wasn't on a sidewalk in Havana, but in a classroom in Miami. It was her second week of school and the first day of band class, the day they auditioned for their places in the orchestra. Isabel twiddled her fingers on the trumpet's keys. She couldn't believe she was standing here in his classroom less than 1 month after stumbling onto Miami Beach with her baby brother in her arms. So much had changed so quickly. After her mother and brother had been taken to the hospital and given a clean bill of health, Lito's brother, Guillermo, took them in until they found a little apartment of their own. His apartment was smaller than their house in Cuba and not near the beach, but if Isabel never saw the ocean again, that was fine by her. Little Mariano was at home, getting fat and happy. Along with the other babies, Mommy was paid to watch at the little in-house daycare she ran. Poppy had gotten a job driving a taxi and was saving up for a car of their own. Senor Castillo planned to go back to school to become an American lawyer. And Senor Castillo was already talking to someone about getting a loan to open a restaurant. Luis got work in a little bodega and Amara in a dress shop. And once Amara became a U.S. citizen, she planned to become a Miami police officer. They were going to be married in this winter. And Isabel, she had started 6th grade. It was hard because she didn't speak English yet. But there were other Cuban kids there, lots more Cuban kids, a few who had come to America by boat, like her, but more who had been born here, Cubano-Americanos, who still spoke Spanish at home. Isabel had quickly made friends, girls and boys who were warm and welcoming, and she knew she would learn to speak English like her teachers soon enough. She was practicing by watching lots and lots of television. At least that's what she told her parents. She would learn, and in the meantime, math and Spanish and art class all still made sense. And so did music. Senor Villanueva and the other students waited for her to play. Isabel had practiced for weeks for this very moment. At first, she couldn't decide what song to play, but then, while watching a baseball game with her father, she figured it out. Isabel adjusted Ivan's Industrial's baseball cap on her head, took a deep breath, and began to play the Star-Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States. But she didn't play it like she'd heard it at baseball games on television. She played it like son cubano, offbeat with a gujeo melody. Isabel played it salsa for Ivan, lost at sea, and for Lito, back in Cuba. She played it salsa for her mother and her father, who had left their homeland, and for her little brother Mariano, who would never know the streets of Havana the way she had. And Isabel played it salsa for herself, so she would never forget where she came from and who she was. Soon, Isabel had everyone in the room clapping along to the beat with her, but as she played, she heard a different rhythm, a beat underneath the one everyone else was clapping to. Her foot tapped in time with the hidden cadence, and she realized with a thrill that she was finally hearing it. She was finally counting the clave. Lita was wrong. She didn't have to be in Havana to hear it, to feel it. She had brought Cuba with her to Miami. Isabel finished with a flourish, and Senor Villanueva and the other students cheered. She thought she might cry for happiness, but she bit back her tears. She had done enough crying over Ivan and Lito. The song of her leaving Cuba to find a new home was over. Today, it was time to start a new song. Mahmoud, Berlin, Germany, 2015. Home. A German song Mahmoud had never heard before played on the radio of the van that took him and his family through the streets of Berlin. The capital of Germany was the biggest city he had ever seen, far bigger than Aleppo. It was filled with nightclubs and cafes and shops and monuments and statues and apartments and office buildings. Almost all the signs were in German, but here and there he saw a sign in Arabic advertising a clothing store or a restaurant or a market. Buildings lined the sidewalks like 10-story walls of brick and glass, and cars and bicycles and buses and trams rattled and honked and clanged by in the streets. This strange, frightening, exciting place was to be Mahmoud's new home. The German government had taken in Mahmoud and his family. For the past 4 weeks, the 4 of them had lived in a school in Munich that had been turned into the simple but clean housing for refugees. They stayed there, free to come and go as they pleased, until a host family agreed to let them share their home while Mahmoud's parents got on their feet. A host family here on this street in the capital of the country. The van pulled up to the curb outside a little green house with white shutters and an A-frame roof. Flowers filled the window boxes like Mahmoud had seen in Austria, and 2 German cars were parked in the driveway. Across the street in a park, teenagers did tricks on skateboards. Mahmud's father slid open the side door for them to climb out, and Mahmud and his brother and mother grabbed the backpacks, filled with clothes, toiletries, and bedrolls the German relief workers had given them. The relief worker who'd driven them led Mahmud's mother and father and brother up the steps to the front door of the little house, but Mahmud stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking around at the neighborhood. Mahmud knew from his history class back in Syria that Berlin had been all but destroyed by the end of World War II, reduced to a pile of rubble like Aleppo was now. Would it take another 70 years for Syria to return from the ashes the way Germany had? Would he ever see Aleppo again? Cries of joy and welcome came from the porch, and Mahmud followed his family up the steps. His mother was being hugged by an elderly German woman, and an elderly German man was shaking hands with his father. The German relief worker had to translate everything everyone said to each other. Mahmud and his family didn't speak German yet, and the family didn't speak any Arabic. The German family had at least managed a sign written in Arabic that said "Welcome home" on it, and the expression they had used was a bit formal. Mahmud still appreciated the effort, and it was better than he could do in German. The man shaking hands with his father turned to Mahmud and Walid, and what Mahmud saw surprised him. He was a really old man. He had wrinkly white skin and thin white hair and that stuck out a bit on the sides, like he'd tried to comb it, but it wouldn't stay put. When the relief worker had told them they'd be staying with a German family, Mahmud had imagined a family like his own, not like his grandparents. His name is Saul Rosenberg, the relief worker translated, and he says, "Welcome to your new home." As Mahmud shook the old man's hand, he spotted a small, thin, ornate wooden box attached to the frame just outside the front door. Mahmud recognized the symbol on the box. It was the Star of David, the same symbol on the flag of Israel. Mahmud tried not to show his surprise. Not only was this couple old, they were Jewish. Back in the Middle East, Mahmud knew Jews and Muslims had been fighting each other for decades. This was a strange new world. Ida Rosenberg's wife broke away from Mahmud's mother and bent down to say hello. She was a wide woman, white-haired like her husband, with big round glasses and a gap-toothed friendly smile. From the pocket of her frock she withdrew a little stuffed rabbit made of white corduroy and offered it to Walid. His eyes lit up as he took it from her. Frau Rosenberg made it herself. She's a toy designer, the translator explained. The old woman said something directly to Mahmud. She says she would have made one for you too, the translator said, but she thought you might be too old for stuffed animals. Mahmud nodded. She can make one for my little sister, though, when we find her, he told the relief worker. We had to hand her off to another boat to save her when we were drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. It was all my fault. I'm the only one who told my mother to do it, and now I have to find her and bring her back. Frau Rosenberg looked questioningly at the relief worker as he translated, and her bright smile faded. Walid ran off to show his mother his new toy, and the old woman led Mahmud into the hallway just inside the house where family pictures were hung. I was a refugee once, just like you, the old woman said through the interpreter, and I lost my brother. She pointed to an old brown photograph in a picture frame of a mother and a father and two children, a boy about Mahmud's age in glasses and a little girl. The father and son wore suits and ties, and the mother wore a pretty dress with big buttons. The girl was dressed like a little sailor. That's me there, the girl. That's my family. We left Germany on a ship in 1939, trying to get to Cuba, to escape the Nazis. I was very little then, and I'm very old now, and I don't remember too much about that time, but I do remember my father being very sick, and a cartoon about a cat. I remember that, and a very nice policeman who let me wear his hat. My father was the only one to make it to Cuba. He lived there for many years, long after the war, but I never saw him again. He died before we could find each other. The rest of us couldn't leave the ship with him, and no other country would take us. So they brought us back to Europe just in time for the war, just in time to go on to run again. The Nazis caught us, and they gave my mother a choice: save me or save my brother. Well, she couldn't choose. How could she? So my brother chose for her. His name was Joseph. Mahmud watched as she reached out and gently touched the boy in the photograph, leaving a smudge on the glass. He was about your age, I think. I don't remember much about him, but I do remember he always wanted to be a grown-up. I don't have time for games, he would tell me. I'm a man now. And when those soldiers said one of us could go free and the other would be taken to a concentration camp, Joseph said, "Take me." My brother, just a boy, becoming a man at last. She paused a moment, then took the picture down off the wall reverently with both hands. They took my mother and my brother away from me that day and left me alone there in the woods. I only survived because a kind old French lady took me in. She told the next Nazis who came knocking that I was family. When the war was over and I was old enough, I came back here to Germany to look for my mother and my brother. I searched for them a long time, but they had died in the concentration camps, both of them. The woman drew a breath. I only have this picture of them because a cousin kept it, a cousin who was hidden away by a Christian family throughout the war. Here in Germany, I met my husband Saul. He had also survived the Holocaust. We stayed because we had family here, and we made a family of our own, Frau Rosenberg said. She spread her arms wide and turned in the little hallway, showing Mahmoud the dozens of pictures of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She put her hand to the old yellowed picture of her family again. They died so I could live. Do you understand? They died so all these people could live. All the grandchildren and nieces and nephews that never got to meet. But you'll get to meet them, she told Mahmoud. You're still alive, and so is your little sister somewhere. I know it. You saved her. And together we'll find her, yes? I promise. We'll find her and bring her home. Mahmoud started to cry, and he turned away and tried to blink back his tears. The old Jewish woman put her arms around him and pulled him into a tight hug. Everything's going to be all right now, she whispered. We'll help you. Ruthie, komm here, Frau Rosenberg's husband called to her. Mahmoud didn't need the translator to tell him that Herr Rosenberg wanted them to join him in the living room. Mahmoud dragged a sleeve across his wet eyes, and Frau Rosenberg tried to hang the picture back on the wall. Her old hands were too shaky, though, and Mahmoud took it from her and hung it back on its nail for her. His gaze lingered on the picture. He was filled with sadness for the boy his age, the boy who had died so Ruthie could live. But Mahmoud also was filled with gratitude. Joseph had died so Ruthie could live, and one day welcomed Mahmoud and his family into her house. The old woman gave Mahmoud's arm a squeeze, and she led them into the living room. Mom and Dad were there, and Walid and Ada Rosenberg, and the space was bright and alive and filled with books and pictures and a family and the smell of good food. It felt like home. So, Isabel made it to home, a new home, and Mahmoud made it to a new home, and Ruthie, Joseph's little sister, made it to a new home. But that hard decision to give up his life to save hers was hard. That he did that, and because he did that, she, Ruthie, the little sister, was able to help Mahmoud and his family. So the author leaves a little note at the end, and he said, Joseph and Isabel and Mahmoud are all fictional characters, but their tales, the stories he told, are based on true stories. Joseph, the MS St. Louis, was a real ship that set sail from Nazi Germany in 1939 with 937 passengers on board, almost all of them Jewish refugees trying to escape the Nazis. The Jews expected to be admitted to Cuba, some of them to live there permanently, some to stay only temporarily until they were admitted into the United States or Canada. But when they arrived, the Jews were told they were not to be allowed to land. The reason was political. The Cuban official who had issued the refugees' entrance visas had fallen out of favor with Cuba's president at the time, Federico Bru. To embarrass the official, Bru retroactively canceled the Jews' visas. Nazi agents in Havana helped keep the Jews out too, by spreading propaganda that turned the Cuban people against the refugees. The Germans didn't want the Jews in their country, but they also loved seeing the refugees turned away by other countries. To the Nazis, it was proof that everybody else in the world secretly agreed with the way the Germans were treating the Jews. Captain Gustav Schroeder was real, and he is remembered today for his kindness toward his Jewish passengers and his efforts to find refuge for them. Otto Schindig was real too, and was not only the Nazi Party representative on the ship, but also something of a spy, carrying secret messages back and forth between Germany and the Nazi agents working in Havana. Evelyn and Renata were the real names of two sisters whose mother chose to remain in Nazi Germany. Their father, Dr. Max Aber, was able to get them off the St. Louis and Havana, and because he had gone ahead of his family to Cuba and had strong connections with the local authorities, none of the other passengers were so lucky, though. Joseph's father, Aaron Landau, was inspired by two different men who really sailed on the MS St. Louis, Aaron Posner and Max Lowe. Aaron Posner, a Hebrew teacher, had been taken from his home in Germany during Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, and sent to Dachau, where he was beaten and humiliated and where he witnessed incredible atrocities. It was Aaron Posner who was released from Dachau after 6 months and told to leave the country within 14 days. And it was Posner who was the victim of Otto Schindig and his firemen while on board. Posner was also one of the mutineers who tried to take control of the ship when the St. Louis was turned away from the United States and Canada. Max Lowe was a Jewish lawyer who, like my fictional Aaron Landau, had been forbidden by the Nazis to practice law. Lowe had continued to give legal advice to sympathetic German lawyers who paid him under the table, but the Gestapo eventually caught on and Lowe was forced into hiding. He joined his wife and 2 children, a boy and a girl, just in time for them all to board the MS St. Louis and make their escape. But like Aaron Landau, Max Lowe was a broken man when he rejoined his family. It was Lowe who tried to commit suicide by jumping off the St. Louis while it lay anchor outside Havana Harbor. The English ship Orduna and the French ship Flandre, both carrying Jewish refugees bound for Cuba, were initially kept out of Havana Harbor, just like the St. Louis. Both ships, to the frustration of the passengers on the St. Louis, were eventually allowed to dock and disembark their own refugees. But what the passengers on the St. Louis didn't know was that the only people allowed off the Orduna and the Flandre were passengers with Cuban passports. The rest, mostly Jews, with now invalid entry visas like the Jewish passengers on the St. Louis, had been turned away to find another country that would take them. The Jewish refugees from the St. Louis who were allowed to enter the United Kingdom were the lucky ones. They escaped the Holocaust. Of the 620 Jewish refugees who returned to continental Europe, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that 254 of them were among the 6 million European Jews who died in the Holocaust. Most of these people were murdered in the killing centers of Auschwitz and Sobibor, says the museum. The rest died in the internment camps, in hiding, or attempting to evade the Nazis. Ruthie, who survived, would be among the approximately 100,000 Jews who live in Germany today, down from around 500,000 Jewish German citizens before World War II. Many more Jews who survived the Holocaust chose not to return to their European home countries, settling instead in the United States and the newly formed country of Israel. The tragedy of the MS St. Louis is now famous and has been the subject of many books, plays, films, and even an opera. Isabel. In 1994, thanks to the large part of the recent collapse of the Soviet Union and the ongoing U.S. embargo against trade with Cuba, hungry citizens of Havana rioted up and down the Malecón. In response, Cuban President Fidel Castro announced that anyone who wanted to leave Cuba could do so without being thrown in jail, which was the usual punishment for trying to escape. It was a strategy Castro had employed before when protests threatened to overwhelm his security forces and overthrow his government. Castro would allow people to leave any way they could, usually on homemade boats and rafts. When all the people angry enough to fight him had fled to America, the protests would stop and things would settle back down again. In the 5 weeks in 1994, when Castro allowed unhappy citizens to leave Cuba, an estimated 35,000 people fled the island for the United States, almost 10 times the number of people who tried to escape to America in all of 1993. Many Americans objected to the sudden influx of Cuban refugees, particularly because at the time, Cubans enjoyed a unique path to becoming American citizens that immigrants from other countries did not. Others recognized Castro's ploy for what it was and argued that the protesters should remain in Cuba in the hope that their riots would finally overthrow the Cuban government. U.S. President Bill Clinton had a big decision to make. Let the Cuban refugees in or send American warships out to turn them away. While he tried to figure out what to do, Clinton ordered any Cuban refugees caught at sea to be sent to a refugee camp at the U.S. military base in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. From there, Cuban refugees could choose to return to Cuba or wait and see if the United States or another country would take them. A few months later, in 1995, Clinton announced that the Cuban refugees at Guantanamo would be allowed entry to the United States, but from the point on, any Cuban refugees caught at sea would be sent back to Cuba, not taken the rest of the way to Florida or sent to Guantanamo. Any Cuban refugees who made it to America could stay. Isabel and her family referred to this new attitude toward Cuban refugees as wet foot, dry foot, though that name wasn't commonly used to describe the situation until the policy was officially made law in 1995. I've also used artistic license to combine the riot that prompts Isabel's family to leave with the U.S. decision to detain Cuban refugees caught at sea. These two events actually happened a month apart, but I have brought them together here to make my story tighter and dramatic. Despite the threat of imprisonment in Cuba and the dangers of sea swells, storms, drowning, sharks, dehydration, and starvation, increasing numbers of Cubans still try to cross the 90 miles of ocean between Havana and Florida each year, including the Pew Research Center. 43,635 Cuban refugees entered the United States in 2015, and that number was surpassed in 2016 by October. In recent years, many Cuban refugees have skipped America's wet foot, dry foot policy altogether and chosen to fly or sail from Cuba to Mexico or Ecuador and then walk north into America, an alternate route observers nicknamed Dusty Foot. But as more and more countries south of the United States close their borders, more Cubans are heading back into the Straits of Florida on homemade boats and rafts. Again, according to the Pew Research Center, 9,999 Cuban refugees entered the United States through the Miami sector in 2015. That same year, the U.S. Coast Guard apprehended 3,505 Cubans at sea, and there is no way of telling how many Cubans die in the attempt each year. In 1994, the year of Isabel's story, an estimated 3 out of every 5 Cuban refugees who attempted the journey died at sea. In 2014, President Barack Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, announced that Cuba and the United States were reestablishing relations with each other, and in 2015, President Obama announced that formal diplomatic relations between the two countries would resume, including the reopening of the respective embassies in Havana and Washington, D.C. As a part of the normalization of relations, the U.S. government relaxed travel restrictions that had barred most of America from visiting Cuba, and in August 2016, the first commercial flight from America to Cuba since 1962 landed in Havana. On January 12, 2017, in one of his last acts in office, President Obama announced the immediate end of the wet foot, dry foot policy. How these changes to the U.S.-Cuban relations and the death of Fidel Castro on November 25, 2016 will affect the future of Cuba and its people remain to be seen. Finally, Mahmoud, the real story about Mahmoud. As I write this, Syria is in its 6th year of one of the most brutal and vicious civil wars in history. The city of Aleppo, Mahmoud's hometown, lies in ruins today because it is a home to a large group of rebels who oppose Bashar al-Assad's war on his own people. The city is under siege, pounded daily by Russian air attacks and the Syrian army artillery. If they didn't leave by 2015, when Mahmoud and his family went on the run, the remaining citizens of Aleppo are now trapped in a war zone. According to the United Nations, more than 470,000 people have been killed since the conflict began in 2011. That's roughly equal to the entire population of Atlanta, Georgia. And more people are dying every day. In just 1 week of fighting in September 2016, the United Nations reported the deaths of 96 children. That's like an entire grade level of children dying every week. In a major offensive in December 2016, the Syrian army conquered an estimated 95% of Aleppo's rebel-held territory, spurring a new humanitarian crisis as hundreds of thousands more civilians were caught in the crossfire. Fighting in Aleppo continues today, and those who survive often have nowhere to live. The Guardian newspaper estimates 40% of the city's infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed. Whole neighborhoods lie in ruins. Markets, restaurants, shops, apartment buildings, nothing has been spared. Almost no one goes to work anymore or to school. Every tree in the city has been cut down for firewood, and when they run out of trees, the Syrians had to burn school desks and chairs to heat their homes. Hospitals, if they still stand, have no medicine or equipment to treat patients. It's no wonder, then, that more than 10 million Syrians have been displaced from their homes. Of those 10 million, the United Nations estimates that 4.8 million Syrians have left their country as refugees. That's more people than live in the entire state of Connecticut or Kentucky or Oregon. And more are fleeing every day, leaving behind everything they owned and everything they knew, just to escape the war and bloodshed, just to survive. But where did they go? The United Nations reports that Turkey is already home to more than 2.7 million registered Syrian refugees, many of them in refuge camps like the one in Kilis that Mahmoud and his family passed through. Other countries in the region, like Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq, have all received huge numbers of Syrian refugees, but these resources are stretched to the limit, and the public sentiment in many countries has turned against the influx of immigrants. Millions more refugees try to reach Europe, where countries like Germany and Sweden and Hungary have accepted hundreds of thousands of refugees. But getting there is difficult, often deadly. According to the International Organization of Migration, more than 3,770 refugees died trying to cross the Mediterranean by boat in 2015. The experiences of Mahmoud and his family are based on things that really happened to different Syrian refugees. In 2015, a group of about 300 refugees who had detained at a Danish school refugee camp finally had enough of being held for no reason. As one, they marched up the highway toward Sweden, forming a human chain that stopped traffic, and cheering bystanders really did stand on an overpass and toss food down to them. A similar protest took place in Hungary a week before, when thousands of refugees marched from Budapest to the Order of Austria. I have combined the two events in this book. Mahmoud and his mother and father were composites of different refugees I read about, but Walid is specifically based on a now famous photograph of a 5-year-old boy from Aleppo named Amran Daknish. In the picture, Amran sits alone in the back of an ambulance after surviving an airstrike, his feet bare, his face bloody, his body covered in dirt and gray ash. He's not crying, he's not angry. Maybe he's in shock, or maybe he's just used to it. This is the only life he knows, because his country has been at war as long as he's been alive. He is a member of the United Nations He is a member of what the United Nations warns will become a lost generation of Syrian children if nothing is done to help them now. That's our book. You guys can make a difference. You can welcome people, and you can be kind to each other, and you can accept everybody for who they are. We are grizzlies, and we are kind. So we're always stronger together, and we love each other, and we take care of each other. So let's be the change and show that anybody in the grizzly family is welcome. Thanks for joining me. I've really enjoyed reading to you. I miss you guys. Miss you a lot. So if you want to read other books by Alan Gratz, check out the Libby app. I believe Mrs. Ellison can help you in her Canvas course pick up some books. He's an awesome author. Refugee by Alan Gratz. And I want to give a shout out to Alan. Thank you so much for allowing us to listen to your book. It's a great day to be a grizzly.